Hi everyone, this is audap. Let's continue our game of Iwaihime on PC.
先輩が僕を呼んでくれたから。
Kane smiled with tears in her eyes.
あの若造、一体何なんだよ。ちくしょう、あとちょっとだったのによ。
The filth moaned in agony as he staggered through the dark town. Just then, a woman appeared.
はい、おじさま、こんばんは。
あんた、そうだ。警察を呼んでくれ。変な小僧に思いっきりぶっ飛ばされて。
そうね、警察を呼んでもいいわね。でもその前に見せたいものがあるのよ。
Hinagata tapped her phone a few times, then showed the screen to the man. It showed a photo of the man grabbing Kane's shoulder with a vulgar smile.
これは一体。
No matter how you looked at it, it depicted a middle-aged man forcing a reluctant girl down an alley against her wishes. No one who saw it would listen to any excuses he offered to the contrary. And on top of that, it was at his own tattoo parlor. He'd be done for sure if he were caught trying to bring a minor in there.
待ってくれ。金なら払う。
The man brought his hands together and begged when suddenly he found himself hanging in midair. Hinagata had lifted him up by the collar with an unimaginable strength.
うちの子にもう一度近づいたら、身体的、精神的、社会的に完全に抹殺しちゃうからね。っていうか、身のべきに二度と現れるな。 消えな、豚野郎。
Though Hinagata was smiling, her eyes held a ferocity that would make anyone quake in their boots. She threw the man right onto the hood of a parked car. Unable to comprehend what was happening, he fled into the city, spewing snot and tears.
雛形先生。 お二人
Hinagata grinned impishly as she snapped a photo of them. A boy and a girl in a shopping district at night. Clearly an illicit relationship, no matter how you spun it.
証拠写真が学校に職員会議でだだった謹慎定額もう一丁いっちゃう退学冗談よ。間に合ったみたいね。
はい。
間に合ったかはわからないけどね。みなべさん、今日が何日か知ってる？え
Hinagata took out her phone and showed her the date. It was a day earlier than Kane thought. The day when that filthy caterpillar revealed his true colors.
すべて霊障の悪夢だったのよ。そんな本当に夢？
The date on her phone was the same. Kane ran into a nearby convenience store and checked the date on the newspaper and anything else that displayed it. They were all the same. This really was the same night.
どんな辛い夢を見たのやら。かわいそうにね。ダメ。本当に。
Hinagata gestured for her to roll up her shirt. And so Kane timidly did as she was told, baring her stomach.
え、あなたは汚れてなんかいない。綺麗なままよ。
That disgusting caterpillar was nowhere to be found. Kane laughed feebly as she finally burst into tears. To think that hell of a night really had just been a dream.
悪夢に閉じ込められたお姫様を王子様が助け出したってわけ。
先輩はお姫様だから。だからハッピーエンドになれる道は絶対に閉ざされちゃいけない。
That said, there was no way everything would be all wrapped up in a nice bow. The cult leader her mother had been so engrossed with had up and vanished, so she'd probably grow restless at the thought she'd been abandoned again. There was still a chance her next actions wouldn't be for her daughter's benefit. Though one danger had vanished, Kane still had a rough journey ahead until she reached her happily ever after. But this time, she wanted to help her mother. Kane felt she'd never seen eye to eye with her mother due to their poor relationship. But at the end of the day, her mother had never forgotten to pay for her food, nor had she ever denied her their home. Because no matter how poor their relationship was, they were still family. Princess Elise of the Arcane Minobe Kingdom was tough. The queen bee was an adult. Her choices were hers to make. By putting distance between them and making her own choices as an adult, Kane could focus on her own future.
おいら、まあ最初は普通にボンクラな大学に行こうかなって思ってたんだけど、今頃になってやっぱ進路考え直そうって思ってる。
就職ですか？それとも専門学校ですか？
介護士でも目指そうかなって。
おお、これからの高齢化時代、引く手あまたのお仕事ですね。
でもめちゃくちゃ大変な仕事とも聞くな。
どうして介護士に？
私たちってさ、家やらお金やらいろいろなことを守られて生きてきたでしょ。でもさ、老いるとまた守られなきゃならなくなるんだよね。おいらは自分がこれまで守られてきたことに感謝して、おいらたちを社会的に守ってきてくれた人たちを今度は守ることのできる仕事に就きたい。
ほう、模範解答で即採用な感じです。離職率も高いって聞きますよ。理想だけで務まる楽な仕事とも思えませんが。
そこは甘えるつもりはないしそれに打算もあるよ。財産たっぷり持った老人とラブラブになっちゃって遺産をあげるとか言われちゃうかもね。
なんて邪悪でグレートな志望動機だ。
そのくらいたくましい方が先輩らしくて好きかな。
まあ介護士ってのは第二志望、第一志望は他にあるんだ。
なんでしょう、聞いてもいいですか？
私だけの王子様を捕まえることかな。
その前に王子様を見つけるのが先じゃないですか。
それはもう大丈夫、見つけてるから。というか射程範囲内。あ、ナッチ、外見て、外。ウルトラレアカードが風に飛んでる。
どこどこ？
Right when Natsuya ran over to the window, Kane dove into Suzumu's chest and kissed him right on the lips. Tsubakiko and Lydia blushed and were rendered speechless. Suzumu wore a look of utter confusion, while Kane's cheek held a red tinge. Natsuya tried to jump out the window in search of the ultra-rare card.
王子様にファーストキスあげちった。
あ、
絶対にエリス姫はムーンスートの王子様とハッピーエンドするぞ。それまでエリス姫の冒険は絶対に終わらない。
Right. Well, we're at the end of Kane's chapter. So we have one more chapter. Well, I think 2 more chapters to go potentially. But let's continue on since it's still early in the evening.
姉上様、口をしゅうございます。そなたの無念と進も、我が鹿と引き受けようぞ。小賢しき人鬼どもの5つ子の邪法によって分けられたすすだが、再び一つに戻ることを誰も食い止められはせぬ。六神彦の御事の呪いは一つに戻る。そして兄上様のご無念を慰めるに足る大災悪となりて、人鬼どもを必ずや滅ぼすのだ。
スズム、もうすぐご飯できるから、それくらいにしてシャワー浴びてきたら？
It didn't seem Suzumu had hurt her. His heart and soul were devoted solely to his training. Tsubakiko called out to him again, but his focus remained unbroken. I felt like something was coming into view. The divine curse had resided in both of them, feeding off their mental trauma. Twice had my fist reached them. Perhaps the second time was also a fluke, but it had reached them nonetheless. At first, I only felt it with my fingers, but this time I felt it with my palm, a resistance of sorts. Perhaps this was arrogant, but I felt I needed to say it. Step by step, I was slowly but surely approaching the essence of the divine tribute style. I'd already felt it with my hand. I just had to grasp it. Grasp it, clench my hand into a fist, and dedicate it.
Sit! あれ、キコちゃん。
食べる？ご飯温め直すよ。話しかけても全然聞こえてないんだもん。すっごい集中力だったね。
うん、もう少しつかめそうなんだ。
つかめるとどうなるの？
みんなを助けられると思う。
みんなって？
The faces of those in the LCSC suffered from hauntings flashed through my head, but they weren't the only ones. The divine curse had lasted 1,000 years. Simply saving a few of its descendants wouldn't cut it, I could tell. So all I could say was this.
みんなだよ。みんな、僕が助けたい。
All the people who'd suffered from the machinations of the divine curse. The shrine's visitors went to pray, not at the main hall, but the worship hall built in front of it. Many unfamiliar with the shrine assumed that it was the main hall. The Shintai for the god deified in this shrine was stored in, or deified in the shrine was stored in the main hall, however, not the worship hall. As such, it was regarded as sacred, and not even the chief priest could enter without permission. There were some shrines where not even the head priest ever beheld their shrine's Shintai. Iwaimoto Shrine's main hall was only open a few days a year for cleaning, but the general public wasn't allowed inside, just the chief priest of the Kurakamis and the representatives of the parishioners. Thus, it was a very sacred and majestic place for Toei. A bulky temple bell hung from a thick rope. The room was decorated reverently, signifying this bell was unmistakably this shrine's Shintai. But the bell was neither fancy nor all that special. It was a cursed bell covered faintly in soot that no amount of polish could ever remove. The cursed millennium began from the moment Susanome was sealed inside it and the soot-gathering ritual was conducted. Since the bell was hanging off the ground, no one could crawl into it if they wanted. Toei had tried to do just that as a child and was scolded harshly. She was told the area under the bell was very sacred and thus off limits. Toei had come to the dimly lit main hall all by herself. She kneeled in front of the bell. After that, she quietly opened her mother's letters. Read this only when you can no longer bear the stones in your stomach. The agony in her stomach was nigh unbearable by now. Meaning, the time had come. The foreword contained information from her mother and grandmother had passed down. The both of them had discerned that the seal on the cursed soot would break someday, but they couldn't just let that come to pass. To seal the soot away forever and to keep this land safe. That was the duty passed down to the daughters of the Kurakami family, generation after generation. It seemed her grandmother had been seriously considering how to prepare for that day. The seal had almost broken several hundred years ago, but the crisis was averted when they divided up the soot within the quintuplet spell. And that was the only way the Kurakamis had of extending it. But the tome with the spell had been lost to a fire. Thus there was an urgent need to find an alternative to a spell. As a result, they had discovered one last viable resort. That final resort was written in the letter. First of all, the seal could not last forever. That was a fact. But it was mere wishful thinking that diluting the soot at just the right time would prevent a full-blown calamity. In the end, the daughters of the Kurakamis would not be rewarded for keeping the curse sealed for 1,000 years. Despite that, however, there was one last resort that could weaken the calamity at least a little. Her grandmother had once considered using it to end her own cursed life. She couldn't bear the thought of having a child doomed to suffer from the same agony as her. But in the end, she couldn't help but believe in the unfulfilled dream that she, her ancestors, and her descendants had all clung to until the bitter end. That the curse would somehow end, and Roku Gamihiko no Mikoto's wrath would be quelled. Otherwise, there would be no reward for the 1,000 years of suffering, which was why the last resort was only for when all hope of that miracle seemed lost. A way to delay the curse for as long as possible once the current sacrifice had made peace with her fate. Someone who had never borne that burden might have given up at the realization that the calamity was inevitable. But the sacrifices of the Kurakami family were familiar with suffering. All they wished for was that it would be worth something. And Toei was no different. Toei made that vow and looked up at the dimly lit bell. It shone there in solemn silence.
それにしても陸奥の末裔め、一度ならず二度も我らを返り討ちにするとは。そなたはどうする？我らのすすすべてを集めれば十分な災厄となろう。あれのすすはあればよいが、たやすくは手に入るまい。それでもあれの生き気も欲するのか。そなたの手で自ら災厄を下したいと願うか。
無論にございます。兄上様のご無念を晴らすことこそ我らの悲願。五つ子の邪法にて別れた身とはいえ、その志は姉上様に勝るとも劣りません。
She slowly stood up. Her gaze was fearless, her eyes shining scarlet. The bringer of the calamity, Tsubakiko Harumiya. It happened long ago, when I was still a kid in kindergarten. Just like every other little girl my age, I was a proper lady. For me, playing house was a perfect recital of when I'd someday be a housewife too. I tried acting even cuter than normal when I was in front of the boys. I'd even get in trouble for playing with mom's makeup and cookware sometimes. I didn't mean any harm, of course, because I was dead serious about my dream, even back then. To become the perfect wife.
はいはい、先生はお父さんの役ね。ただいま。あなた、おかえりなさい。お風呂にする？ご飯にする？じゃあお風呂からにしようかな。お風呂沸いてますよ。背中流してあげるね。あら嬉しい。先生も椿子ちゃんみたいなお嫁さん欲しいな。
Even when Tanabata came around, my wish was the same. I want to be the perfect wife. But I was a kid. I never thought about it much deeper than that. I wanted to be a wife, but I never even considered that I'd need to marry someone to make that happen. Pretty stupid, huh? That's like the first thing you're supposed to think of.
お嫁さんになりたかったら男の子と喧嘩しちゃダメだぞ。
でもマー君、椿子のスカートめくっ
よ。
それにしても女の子がドロップキックをかますのはな。
I barely remembered it, but apparently I'd kicked a boy so hard he smashed his head into the edge of a locker, sending him to the hospital. Personally, I thought it was a suitable price to pay for trying to steal a glance at my panties. I wanted to be a wife, and yet I'd constantly be picking fights with boys back in kindergarten.
だからあなた、乱暴な漫画は椿子の手の届くところに置かないでって言ったでしょ。いい椿子、お父さんの漫画は真似しちゃいけない乱暴な漫画なのよ。素敵なお嫁さんになりたかったら優しい女の子にならなくちゃ。乱暴はダメよ。
パパにもドロップキックとか円髄蹴りとかシャイニングウィザードとかもうやっちゃダメだぞ。第一な、お嫁さんというのは男の子に嫌われたらなれないんだぞ。
Those words were such a shock to me. I'd never realized you needed a boy's approval before you could be a wife.
これからはもう少し女の子らしくしなくっちゃね。
男の子とも仲良くしなさい。そうしたらきっと素敵なお嫁さんになれるぞ。
本当？じゃあ私これからはもう喧嘩しない。優しい女の子になる。グッドモーニングモーニング。朝だよ。
Tsubakiko opened the curtains with a whoosh. The sun's warm rays bathed the room in their light.
ほらスズム、いつまで寝てるの？お寝坊さ
ん。何事？
朝なの、朝。男子ってこういうシチュエーション大好きなんでしょ？もっと喜んでくれてもいいのに。
Most people would see this as a standard girl next door romantic comedy act and wish the two of them dead in an envious rage. But Susumu was normally quite the early bird. In contrast, Tsubakiko was a real night owl. Even when she went to bed, she'd spend 30 minutes squirming about playing Wanyadora, not wanting to waste her MP. Wanyadora was a free-to-play mobile puzzle game constantly being pushed in commercials and ads all over. As such, it had taken her a few days before she could adjust to waking up Susumu each morning like his future wife might.
ずいぶん久しぶりだね。キコちゃんに起こしてもらうのは。起こしてくれてありがとう。
それでね、スズム、朝ごはん作ってみたんだけど。
それは嬉しいな。でも珍しいね。どうしたの？急に。
Last night, she'd had a dream that brought back all sorts of memories to her innocent kindergarten days when she'd sworn to become the perfect wife. The memory was so pure and exciting that before she knew it, she'd woken up at the crack of dawn. Thus she made a spur-of-the-moment decision to make breakfast for Susumu. Despite that, he was as composed as ever. Though a girl his age had used her spare key to sneak into his room, he wasn't the least bit shaken. Tsubakiko brought the food from her own apartment on a tray. The hallway was rich with the scent of cooking. She must have cooked in her room. She struggled to make her way through the door while her hands were occupied with carrying the tray.
無理に運ばないで、キコちゃんの部屋で食べてもいいのに。
乙女の部屋は男子は立ち入り禁止なの。
僕の部屋には勝手に入ってくるのに。
いいでしょ、私たち親戚同士なんだから。
なんかおかしい気がするけど、気のせいかな。
気のせい。さあ召し上がれ。
White rice, miso soup, seasoned seaweed, stir-fried spinach, bacon, and eggs. The kind of breakfast you'd see in any average household.
ご飯おいしいね。
他には？
お味噌汁もおいしいよ。ヒコちゃんはお料理上手だね。
他には？
ほうれん草もおいしいよ。僕好きなんだ。
他には？
ベーコンエッグも念入りに火が通ってて美味しいと思うよ。
ちゃんと火通さないと危ないからね。特に気をつけたの。
美味しいよ。こんなにバリッとおせんべいみたいに食べられるベーコンエッグなんて初めてかな。
そう？今流行りの焼き方なの知らないの？遅れてる
Tsubakiko made hasty excuses with a blush. Suzumu chuckled at the sight. Anyone could tell from a glance that she'd overcooked the bacon and eggs a little. No, scratch that. A lot. In actuality, Tsubakiko had borrowed the rice, miso soup, and spinach from her mother. In other words, all she'd actually cooked were the bacon and eggs. Her room currently reeked of smoke. She'd actually wanted to make more than that. But the disaster with the bacon and eggs had shattered her spirit.
お嫁さんって大変だね。
どうして？
毎日旦那様より早起きして朝ごはん作るんでしょ？こんな朝ごはん一つ作るだけで青息と息なんて全然だよね。
でもヒコちゃんはこうして作ってくれたよ。僕はとっても嬉しいし、きっと未来の旦那さんも喜んでくれると思うな。
スズムは嬉しい？
嬉しいよ。
こんな情けないベーコンエッグを作るお嫁さんでも？
僕のためを思って作ってくれたものならすごく嬉しいよ。そんな朝ごはんを毎日食べられたら毎日仕事を頑張れると思うよ。だからヒコちゃんの未来のお婿さんはきっと幸せだと思うよ。
His words warmed Tsubakiko's heart. If her married life were anything like this, she felt she could take on the whole world. And if Suzumu were the husband, she believed she could do anything. Thus she swore to keep up her training so she could someday be the perfect housewife.
花嫁修行に付き合ってくれてありがとう。素敵なお嫁さんになりたいから。
僕でよければいつでも協力するよ。
ありがとうサンキューだよ。
Tsubakiko was bursting with joy. And so the two of them ate their crispy bacon and eggs like your average newlywed couple. I almost always rode my bike to school. But when Suzumu and I were both riding our bikes, it felt like we were taking a nice romantic trip together. The early bird gets the worm, so they say, and that's precisely how I felt. I was in such a good mood today. I felt like I was one step closer to becoming the perfect wife. I was on top of the world. Everything was going so well. So why did all have to go south?
まだ祭るか？あ？血祭り足りねえか？
A group of delinquents laid sprawled out on the ground before springing up and groveling on their knees.
させ血まみれ天女のバキコさんとは知らず。
次にススコーにちょっかい出したら祭る。問答無用で血祭る。
失礼しました。
コちゃんって強いね。
そりゃそうだぜ。何しろ昔は。
Normally, I'd slug Atsura right in the gut to keep him from yapping about my past. But I wouldn't be fooling anyone after that horrendous display just now. Okay, I should probably back up and give some context here. Suzumu and I met up with Atsura at the Iwaihime shopping district this morning. After that, we saw some idiots trying to bully one of the guys from our school. But after I politely asked them to cut it out, they said some choice words that would invoke any lady's wrath. I couldn't remember a thing after that. Next thing I knew, I was here. And with that, my dream went up in flames. Now Suzumu knew of my dark and sordid past. Things were really awkward between us that day. More accurately, I just didn't know how to approach him after that. So I simply kept avoiding him at every turn, though I knew I couldn't keep it up forever. However patient Suzumu might be, even he had his limits. So when school ended for the day, he grabbed me by the arm.
キコちゃん、朝のことまだ気にしてるの？
Of course. You were the last guy I wanted knowing my secret. Yeah, right. Like he'd ever believe me saying something that ladylike at this point. Why me?
まあ今さら可愛こぶったってもう手遅れだしね。とほほとほほだよ。
でもかっこよかったよ。同じ学校の人が難儀してるのをみんな見て見ぬふりをして通り過ぎてたのに、キコちゃんは勇敢に声をかけたんだもの。それに助けた彼はキコちゃんの知り合いだったわけでもないんでしょ。だからなおさらキコちゃんはかっこよかったよ。
そう？
うん。あんな剣幕で怒鳴ってる不良を前にキコちゃんはすっごく冷静だったし。
It was more like I lost my shit and gave in to the Satsui no Hado, though. But apparently it looked like I was totally in control from behind. Anyway, I was glad he was proud of me for standing up for that guy, but that didn't excuse the slaughter that followed.
僕はそれを含めてもかっこよかったと思うよ。普段はおしとやかでも言うべき時やるべき時はやるって女性好きだから。
好き
Apologies, my eyes are really dry. I never would have expected to find Suzumu's type like this. Did I just trip a romance flag without even trying to? Was I seriously that lucky?
むしろ情けないのは僕だよ。ああいう時は男の僕が率先して出るべきだったのに、ついぼんやりしてしまって。僕がしっかりしていればキコちゃんが体を張る必要もなかったし、何よりそうして一日気にすることもなかっただろうし、それを申し訳ないと思ったこととかっこよかったよってことどうしても伝えたかったんだ。
私のこと幻滅してない？
しないよ。それどころかもっとキコちゃんのこと好きになったよ。
本当？
うん。強い女性って素敵だよね。
本当に？私をおだてるために適当なことを言ってんじゃないの？
そんなわけないよ。 それに僕がキコちゃんに幻滅なんてしてたら一緒に帰ろうなんて誘うと思う？
Suzumu flashed me a serene smile, erasing my suspicions I may have had of him being insincere. In the end, I was the only one who'd been worked up about the whole thing. Suzumu hadn't been let down a bit. Instead, I'd gained some serious points with him in a way I hadn't expected. It was like I'd risen from hell to heaven. But I knew I shouldn't put the cart before the horse like that. It was a bad habit of mine. We stopped by a fast food joint on our way home, where I told him all sorts of tales of my edgier years. I expected him to be horrified for sure, but instead he listened with a gleam in his eyes.
かっこいいな。仲間を守るために戦うなんて本当にすごいや。僕も人のために戦えるようにもっともっと精進しなきゃ。
でもいくらなんでもさすがにドン引きでしょ。今でこそこんな可愛い子アピールしてるけど、かつてはとんでもなかったし。
かつてはかつてだよ。今がそうなわけじゃない。それにキコちゃんの武勇伝はどれも相応の理由があっての喧嘩ばかりだったと思うよ。弱い者いじめとか何の意味もなく暴力を振るってたとか、そういうのは一つもなかったと思うよ。
Well, yeah, I was the head of the Bloodstained Angels attack unit. I would never stoop so low. We were vigilantes. We never laid a hand on the innocent. Instead, we were the kind who went around dishing out punishment to hot-headed scumbags who did sink to those levels.
ね、別にキコちゃんは恥ずかしいことをしてたわけじゃないと思うよ。
まあお天道様に胸張って言えることじゃないよね。
今はもう卒業したんだし、もう気にしなくてもいいんじゃないかな。人間誰にだって反抗期みたいなものはあるし、僕だって親に反抗して悪いことしたことはあるしさ。
スズムが悪いことってどんな？
誰にも内緒だよ。
内緒にするする。私とスズムだけの秘密。
Suzumu whispered in my ear.
本当にスズムが？
だから内緒だって声が大きいよ。ね、それに比べたらキコちゃんのやんちゃ時代だって特別なことじゃないよ。
I couldn't help but laugh at what a big deal I'd been making of all of this. I literally roared with laughter, and before long, Suzumu joined in. I'd been worrying so much about this whole thing, but telling it all to him took such a load off my chest. I felt like I could even invite him to my room with no further reservations. We continued chatting in the dying sunlight as we walked our bikes home. In hindsight, Suzumu was probably being considerate of me in his own little way. In the end, his smile had laid my heart to bare. But he'd also confessed his own shameful past, so we were even. Therefore, I had no reason to be embarrassed anymore. It was like, I don't know, like we'd already crossed some sort of emotional threshold. Now that I had nothing to hide from Suzumu, I felt I could show him the real me in its truest meaning. A girl would have to be crazy to let a guy like him out of her grasp. So I had to take him for my own. I wouldn't let anyone else have him. I had nothing left to fear. I'd confess to him right on the spot. That way, nobody else could ever lay a finger on him.
ね、
And why don't we stop it there for the evening? This is audapostrophe. You've been watching Iwaihime on PC. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed watching. I will see you at the next stream.